All right. Last week we talked about Huck Finn. Talked about the first 9 chapters. Skipped the middle section. But basically, the middle section, Jim and Huck run into these two guys who are like con men, swindlers, the king and the duke, right? And they go on some adventures with them, and that brings us to the end of the book after they do to kind of betray Huck. Anybody pick up on that? Because that's where we pick up this week with Huck Finn. It's chapter 30. I think it's... Where did you start this week? What did I assign? Is it 31 to 40? All right, so let's look at chapter 31 then. 31 says, "We doesn't stop again at any town for days and days, kept right on going down the river." So when he says we, he's referring to Huck, Jim, the king, and the duke, who are the two con men, right? So they kept right going down the river. We was down south in the warm weather now, and a mighty long ways from home. We begun to come to trees with Spanish moss on them, hanging down from the limbs like long gray beards. It was the first I ever see it growing, and it made the woods look solemn and dismal. So now the frauds reckoned they was out of danger, and they begun to work the villages again. So the frauds are the king and the duke, these two guys that they ended up hooking up with. First they done a lecture on temperance, but they didn't make enough for them both to get drunk on. Then in another village they started a dancing school, but they didn't know no more how to dance than a kangaroo does. So the first prance they made, the general public jumped in and pranced them out of town. So these guys are trying to con their way through life, right? They're trying to make money by swindling people in these different towns as they go along. And what happens? What do they do to betray Huck? They sell out Jim, like they literally sell him, right? And Huck gets upset. And what Huck says, anyway, it's on page 1420. Now, Huck already knows what happened. Huck figures it out before they tell him. But when they do tell him, look at his reaction on 1420. I'll start with the first part in quotation marks there. "Do you reckon that nigger would blow on us?" Basically, he would tell on us. We'd skin him if he'd done that. All right, this is, I think it's the Duke talking. "How can he blow? Ain't he run off?" So this is Huck saying to the Duke, "I thought he ran away," because that's what the king and the Duke originally told Huck, right? Because they didn't want Huck to know that they sold him. So Huck's playing stupid right now, right? And he'd say, "I thought he ran away." "No, that old fool sold him and he never divided it with me and the money's gone." "Sold him," I says, and begun to cry. "Why, he was my nigger and that was my money. Where is he? I want my nigger." "Well, you can't get your nigger, that's all, so dry up your blubbering. Looky here. Don't you think you'd venture to blow on us? Blamed if I'd think I'd trust you. Why, if you was to blow on us," he stopped. "But I never see the Duke look so ugly out of his eyes before." I went on a whimpering and says, "I don't want to blow on nobody. I ain't got no time to blow nohow. I got to turn out and find my nigger." So Huck's tears, are they real, or is he just a really good actor? He's a good actor? What if you replace the word nigger with friend in that passage? Is Jim Huck's friend by this point in the story? He hasn't quite realized it? Is he starting to realize it? There's something that the professor said in that video from 60 Minutes. And he said at one point in the story, Huck says they were after us. Right? He felt like they were being pursued and that they were both being chased. Both maybe Huck for being a runaway and Jim for being a runaway slave. But they thought Huck was dead, right? So they wouldn't be chasing Huck. So for him to say they were after us, he now associates himself with Jim as like a party to Jim's situation. And that could be for different reasons. That could be because He could be seen as aiding and abetting a fugitive slave, in a legal sense, a white person helping a black slave to escape. So he feels like he's legally both of them sharing a friendship together, right? They're sharing that runaway for freedom story. Does that make sense? So maybe by this point, if you could replace that word with friend there, say, well, he was my friend and that was my money, I want my friend, maybe these tears aren't just all an act. Maybe he really is upset. Not that he lost his property, right? But that he lost a friend. That's the next part, right? I think that's the next chapter, I believe. Well, no, that was the previous chapter. You're right. He was already upset. So if we go back and what's the climax of a story? What is the climax of any story? It's an action sequence. Action sequence, though, all the events in a story, that's the plot. But what is the climax? It's a particular point in the story. A realization, sometimes like an epiphany on the part of a character, maybe. When he meets Tom and they... Why do you feel like that was a climax? First we need to know what... There's so much explained. So is the climax when everything is explained? I think that's the resolution. When everything is explained to the audience, that's the resolution of the story. That's when stuff gets tied together, right? All the loose ends get tied up and everything gets explained. That's usually like the resolution. Climax is different. What's the climax, Jessica? What do you think? The climax of a story is the most dramatic part, the highest part of suspense, maybe, right? The part where you're like, oh my gosh, they're gonna tell me what's gonna happen. I'm gonna find out, right? The part you've been waiting for. So, I think you can make a pretty good argument that the climax of this story takes place just before that section we were reading. Let's look on page 1417. I wanted to try and find a good audio clip of this, but I couldn't pull it up in time. I don't want to be the one to read it just because I'm not as good of a reader as some of the actors they pay to read this kind of stuff. But this could be considered the greatest climax in American literature just because of the weight of the story and the lesson in the story and the theme, the universal theme that most people in America, especially during that time, could relate to. And this idea that Huck is up against about doing the right thing versus doing the wrong thing, and then what is the right thing and what is the wrong thing to do. Because that's his problem, right? That's his predicament. He's not sure what the right thing to do is. Society has been telling Huck all his life that slavery is right, slavery is okay. If a slave runs away, that's a bad thing. And if you help a slave run away, that's a really bad thing, right? Because that's someone's property. It's like stealing. He's been taught that stealing was wrong. Does that make sense? Yeah, his father taught him, that racism was okay too, right? Like we looked at that section in, I forget what chapter it was. In the first 9 chapters there, we saw the section where, his father is painted as a racist, someone that's, has no value for human life if that life isn't white, right? So Huck's been told these things. Society has made his mind go one way, but then he feels like he's not sure that's the right thing to do. Or maybe the wrong thing is the right thing, which is really confusing, especially to a little kid, right? And I think he articulates that pretty well in the story. Remember, the story is all told from the point of view of Huck. Let's look at page 1417. He just has seen where he talks about seeing the handbill, the reward poster for Jim. And after he leaves, this guy he sees on the street, or maybe it was the kid. Who was it he runs into on the street? It was a boy, right? Another boy? A stranger? Okay. And he leaves the stranger, and it says, I didn't have none. It says, I didn't have none, so he left. I went right to the raft and sat down in the wigwam to think, but I couldn't come to nothing. So he's trying to figure out, how do I get Jim back, right? Like, where's Jim? What do I do? I thought till I wore my head sore, but I couldn't see no way out of the trouble. After all this long journey, and after all we'd done for them scoundrels, the king and duke, here it was all come to nothing, everything all busted up and ruined, because they could have the heart to serve Jim such a trick as that, and make him a slave again all his life, and amongst strangers, too, for $40 dirty. So they put a price on Jim's life, basically, of $40. Now, it's interesting that not only does Huck see a problem with them selling Jim back into slavery, but he says it's worse because they sold him into slavery with strangers. It's interesting that Huck could apply these degrees of severity to slavery, right? Like some people would say it wouldn't matter. I wouldn't want to be a slave for the kindest slave master there is. I wouldn't want to be a slave for the worst slave master, right? Doesn't matter if it's a stranger or if it's familiar. Doesn't matter if it's Miss Watson or if it's Silas Phelps or whoever it is, right? Doesn't matter. But Huck is like seeing that, oh, okay, there are different degrees of slavery. So it's even worse that they sold him to strangers. Now, once you start seeing slavery that way, as there are different degrees of it, doesn't that make it easier to justify slavery and say, well, there are some really bad slave owners and they shouldn't own slaves, but there are some good ones too, and they should be able to own slaves because they take good care of them, right? If you assign these degrees of severity to slavery, doesn't that make it easier to justify for people? If you're trying to justify it. Now, we don't know that Huck's trying to justify it. We just know that other people in Huck's social circle probably are trying to justify it. So he's grown up around people that try to justify slavery, right? So maybe that's where that comes in, this fact that, because it's a detail in the story, right? He doesn't just say they sold him for $40. He said, to strangers, too. That makes it worse. Like, yeah, that's where he's going next. Yeah, that's where he goes next. He says, once I said to myself, it would be 1,000 times better for Jim to be a slave at home where his family was, as long as he'd got to be a slave. And so I'd better write a letter to Tom Sawyer and tell him to tell Miss Watson where he was. But I soon give up that notion for two things. She'd be mad and disgusted at his rascality and ungratefulness for leaving her, and so she'd sell him straight down the river again. And if she didn't, everybody naturally despises an ungrateful nigger, and they'd make Jim feel it all the time. And so he'd feel ornery and disgraced. So either way, right here, he's got Jim's welfare in mind, doesn't he? Right? Not just as a piece of property, but as a person. He seems to have Jim's feelings and considerations in mind. Changes a little bit, right? And then think of me. So here's reason number 2 he didn't do it. Then think of me. It would get all around that Huck Finn helped a nigger to get his freedom. And if I was ever to see anybody from that town again, I'd be ready to get down and lick his boots for shame. That's just the way. A person does a low-down thing, and then he doesn't want to take no consequences of it. So he's got Jim's thoughts in mind, but then he's got his reputation in mind too. So it's not the fact that helping a slave is the right or the wrong thing to do. It's what are the consequences of his actions going to be, regardless of whether they were the right thing, it was the right thing or the wrong thing to do to help Jim. What would the consequences be? And he's saying the consequences would be people will look at me terribly. Regardless of whether he did the right thing or the wrong thing, doesn't matter. He's thinking the consequences are going to be bad either way. Can't do that. Thinks as long as he can hide it, it ain't no disgrace. That was my fix exactly. The more I studied about this, the more my conscience went to grinding me, and the more wicked and low down and ornery I got to feeling. And at last, when it hit me all of a sudden that there was the plain hand of Providence slapping me in the face and letting me know my wickedness was being watched all the time from up there in heaven, whilst I was stealing a poor old woman's nigger that hadn't never done me no harm, and now was showing me there's one that's always on the lookout, and ain't a going to allow no such miserable things to go only just so fur and no further. I most dropped in my tracks, I was so scared. It's interesting, right? What does he think? He thinks God is looking down at him as a terrible person for helping to steal a person from Miss Watson. Is that what he's saying? He thinks God is disappointed in him because he stole someone's property. Yeah, Miss Watson is the one that she's the most adamant about teaching him about God. And if you go back to the very beginning of the story, she teaches the slaves about God too. She calls the slaves in from the field and says, "Everybody, come in, it's time to, read the Bible." Yeah. She said, yeah, call in the slaves so that we can pray. That's Mark Twain pointing out hypocrisy there in the beginning of the story. Having Miss Watson be the religious figure in the story, yet she's calling the slaves in from the field to pray. That's Mark Twain. He points out hypocrisy, and sometimes he does it subtly. Sometimes it's not so subtle, right? But that's him pointing out, like, here are these people that claim to be Christians. Here's this country that claims to be full of Christians, yet they hold slaves as property. But anyway, you've got this section here, and he's feeling upset, he's feeling terrible, he's feeling guilty, and he thinks it's because God is disappointed in him for helping to steal property from Miss Watson, that property being Jim. He goes on, "Well, I tried the best I could to kind of soften it up somehow for myself by saying I was brung up wicked, and so I weren't so much to blame." That's important. He's trying to say, like, why do I feel so terrible? Why do I feel so guilty? Why is God so disappointed in me? And he tries to justify it to himself. He said, well, I was brought up wicked. So he does partly realize that society isn't always right, right? His father wasn't necessarily right. He seems to realize this. He seems to realize my dad was wicked. That's why he ran away from his dad, right? And he realizes that he was brought up wicked. And he thinks that it's like inherited, right? This is just the way he is. There's nothing he can do to fight. He's trying to justify the way he feels and his wickedness. But he's not making the connection that if he was brought up wicked, that means his dad was wicked. Well, then why aren't the thoughts that his dad has about slavery and about people, why aren't they wicked too? Like, he's missing that connection, right? He's saying he was brought up wicked, but he feels bad about freeing a slave. Like, he's missing something here, right? And he's a boy. He's not expected to be wise. He's not supposed to be a wise character, necessarily. But does he have a developed conscience? Does he know the difference between right and wrong? Does he? You're shaking your head. He does. He knows the difference between right and wrong. Yeah. So he has a conscience. And when we say conscience, I think it's fair enough to say that's like the voice of God within your mind, right? Knowing the difference between right and wrong. And he's saying his conscience is grinding him. So he does have some idea of what's right and what's wrong. Is his idea of what's right and wrong accurate? What do you think, Brett? He thinks it's wrong to steal property from Miss Watson, even if that property is a human being. He thinks that's wrong. He is confused. He is confused. Why is he confused is the question. Why is he confused about what's right and wrong? Do we ever get confused about what's the right thing to do, what's the wrong thing to do? Then what confuses us? Not everything is black and white, which is an interesting phrase to use for this story. But that's true. Everything is black and white, so sometimes there are gray areas. Is this a gray area, though? Or is this a clear of there's something right and there's something wrong? That's the conflict, right? That's the conflict. There's a conflict between how he grew up, what he's been taught, and what he's experienced with Jim personally. Major conflict between the two. Go ahead.
I think what we think what is right and wrong is slavery,
Hmm.
he thinks it's bad. But then he's telling himself, and he's brought up that is right because they're the opposite.
Yeah.
His real conflict is kind of he's in the right now. But then
He's in the right to think what? You're saying his real conscience is telling him he is right to think
that slavery is
that slavery is wrong.
wrong. But then he's telling himself, well, oh, that's wrong. This is what he's right. So he's doing that by what people say.
Yeah, by people's standards, by society's standards, he's doing wrong. So that's his conflict. That's where we are right now in the story. That's why this is the climax. Because this is the ultimate conflict within the book. Is society right or is Huck right? And when Huck thinks that he might be right, that's actually wrong by society's standards. So he thinks to be wrong is actually to be right. I'm not trying to confuse you, but that's what's going on here. And that's why he's so confused with society's morals. Right. And when you're a kid, you're not really supposed to think for yourself yet. You don't really have rights. You're supposed to do what you're told, not what you think is right or wrong, right? Like when you're a little kid, like you're supposed to follow the rules. You're really not supposed to challenge authority. You're not supposed to challenge society and what they say is right and wrong. You're not supposed to challenge the church. You know, and in most societies, children are, more thought to be seen than heard, right? That's an interesting point. So he doesn't have the same innocence as other children because he's taking care of himself. The product of this evil father. So that's an interesting point. So maybe he's more mature than other children, and maybe he's got a more mature view of society and what's right and wrong than society itself does. Does that make sense? I think that's a pretty good point. So that's where we are in the story. This is the ultimate conflict. What's wrong? What society and what the church and what other people tell you is right, or what you believe in your heart is right? That's where he's at. So why is he scared? We already know he talked about that the repercussions of his actions could lead to everyone hating him. Is that a reason to be scared? Scared because of what they told him at Sunday school, that if you do wrong, you're going to go to hell, right? That's what he was taught. That's a scary thing, right? Especially for a little kid to think, boy, if I do the wrong thing, I could go to hell. That could be a scary thought for an adult too, right? Doesn't just have to be a kid. So maybe that's where the fear comes in, because he's talking about God watching over him, because he's about to make a decision. Which direction do I want to go? Am I going to turn Jim in and do the quote-unquote right thing by society? Or am I going to do the wrong thing by society and, help Jim escape? That's where he's at. So why is he scared? Because he feels like God's watching him and God is going to judge him one way or the other. Well, I tried the best I could to kind of soften it up somehow for myself by saying I was brung up wicked, and so I weren't much to blame. But something inside me kept saying, there was the Sunday school, you could have gone to it, and if you'd done it, they'd have learnt you there, and the people that acts as I'd been acting about the nigger goes to everlasting fire. It made me shiver, and I about made up my mind to pray and see if I couldn't try to quit being the kind of boy I was and be better. So I kneeled down, but the words wouldn't come. Why wouldn't they? It weren't no use to try and hide from him. Who was him? Yeah, capital H, right? God. Nor from me neither. I knowed very well why they wouldn't come. It was because my heart weren't right. It was because I weren't square. It was because I was playing double. I was letting on to give up sin, but inside of me, I was holding on to the biggest one of all. He says his heart wasn't right, and that's why he wasn't able to pray this prayer. Is that the case? Is that accurate that his heart wasn't right? Right by whose standards? He thinks his heart isn't right by society's standards. Right? Not his own standards seem to really be pulling him toward freeing Jim. That's where his heart's leading him. But that's not right by society's standards. Yeah. He knows something's wrong. He's just got it all backwards, that's all. He's got everything backwards as he's, giving us this monologue in the book. And he says my heart weren't right. It wasn't right by society's standards. It was right, personally for him because he was feeling at this point. I think all evidence points to him feeling like he should. That's, that is his heart being right. He doesn't see it that way. He's got it kind of flipped. He's got it backwards because of society's influence on him. I was letting on to give up sin, but away inside of me I was holding on to the biggest one of all. I was trying to make my mouth say I would do the right thing, the quote-unquote right thing, and the clean thing, and go to right that nigger's owner and tell where he was, but deep down in me I knowed it was a lie, and he knowed it. You can't pray a lie. I found that out. That's a good line by Mark Twain. You can't pray a lie, right? Because God's going to know. So I was full of trouble, full as I could be, and didn't know what to do. At last I had an idea, and I says, I'll go and write the letter, and then see if I can pray. Why, it was astonishing the way I felt light as a feather, right straight off, all my troubles gone. So I got a piece of paper and a pencil, all glad and excited, and sat down and wrote, Miss Watson, your runaway nigger Jim is down here 2 miles below the Pikesville, and Mr. Phelps has got him, and he will give him up for the reward if you send. Huck Finn. So he sold him out, right? Wrote the letter. Now he's going to be able to pray and say, God, make my heart right, make me feel better about this. I felt good and all washed clean of sin for the first time I had ever felt in my life, and I knowed I could pray now, but I didn't do it straight off. But I laid the paper down and sat there thinking how good it was how all this happened, and how near I come to being lost and going to hell, and went on thinking, and got to thinking over our trip down the river, and I see Jim before me all the time in the day and the nighttime, sometimes moonlight, sometimes storms, and we a floating along, talking and singing and laughing, but somehow I couldn't seem to strike no places to harden me against him, but only the other kind. I'd see him standing my watch on top of his'n instead of calling me, so I could go on sleeping and see how glad he was when I come back out of the fog, and when I come to him again in the swamp, up there where the feud was, and such like times, and would always call me honey and pet me and do everything he could for me, and how good he always was. And at last I struck the time I saved him by telling the men we had smallpox aboard, and he was so grateful, and said I was the best friend old Jim ever had in the world, and the only one he's got now. And then I happened to look around and see that paper. It was a close place. I took it up and held it in my hand. I was trembling, because I got to decide forever betwixt two things, and knowed it. What are the two things he has to decide between? Right. Decide what's right by my conscience or what's right by society's standards. And remember, he's already said that he has a quote-unquote wicked conscience, right? As a product of his upbringing. He thinks he's wicked. I studied a minute, sort of holding my breath, and then says to myself, all right then, I'll go to hell, and tore it up. So not just were the two things deciding between do I do what's right by my conscience or do what's right by society, but am I going to go to heaven or am I going to go to hell? Those are the two things he's ultimately deciding between. And he thinks if he chooses with his conscience, he's going to hell. And that's what he does. All right then, I'll go to hell, and he tears up the letter. That is the climax of the story. He made the decision. He thinks it's the wrong decision. But was it? Was that the wrong decision to make? To decide to free Jim and help him? It's the right thing to do. Ashley?
Not about that, but when you say to free him, but he's already taken off the
Yeah, he's been now he has to go free him again, basically.
How is he going to do that though?
They have a plan. You need to read on for that. He comes up with a plan with Tom Sawyer, which is kind of the last few chapters that you were assigned, and they come up with a quite an elaborate plan to free Jim, which is interesting. hmm Yeah, so Jim got sold off by the king and the duke, so they sold him to somebody else back into slavery, and now Huck has decided, I'm going to free him, I'm going to get him back and help him out, help my friend. But he thinks he's going to go to hell for it, right? So now we can start with some of the resolution. I shoved the whole thing out of my head. Let me get my computer back here, sorry. I shoved the whole thing out of my head, and I would take up wickedness again, which was in my line being brung up to it, and the other weren't. This is interesting, and it actually relates to some of the stuff that the Transcendentalists said. I think specifically Thoreau. At one point he said, if my natural inclinations are to do wicked things, wicked maybe by society's standards or the church's standards or whatever, if my natural inclinations are to do those things, then I should do them. That's what Thoreau said. He said, if I didn't, I wouldn't be being true to myself. You remember what Emerson said about being true to yourself? That was like a big theme throughout Emerson's work. Be true to yourself. He said, imitation is suicide. Remember, they were so big on individualism and originality and not worshiping the past God of their forefathers and developing their own relationship with God and not imitating what came before them. So Emerson set this standard that imitation is suicide, be true to yourself. And then Thoreau takes it a step further and says, well, if the right thing to do is to be true to yourself, then you don't listen to society, don't listen to religion, don't listen to what other people tell you is right or wrong, follow your instincts. If those instincts happen to be evil, the best thing you can do otherwise you're not being true to yourself. And you're going to double, as Huck would say, right? So that's exactly what Huck is doing here. He's following the advice of Thoreau. He thinks his instincts are evil, but he says, you know what? I'll be wicked then. The right thing for me to do is to be true to myself. That's what he decided. He seems to be wrong, right? But that's what he's doing. Anybody ever think that? Like, society's telling me this is wrong, but I think it's right. What do I do? That's something that, people might face, on a daily basis. Can't think of a concrete example right now, but Huck's example is a pretty good one. Should you be true to yourself? Should you be true to your instincts and your thoughts, or listen to what society tells you? That's where he's at anyway. So he talks about he's going to take up wickedness again, which was in my line being brung up to it, and the other weren't. And for a starter, I would go to work and steal Jim out of slavery again. And if I could think up anything worse, I would do that too, because as long as I was in and in for good, I might as well go the whole hog. I like that section, right? He's like, if I'm going to be wicked, anything else I can think of that's wicked, I'm going to do that too, right? Might as well go all the way in. All right, and then they get on to the plan to actually free Jim. So that's Huck Finn. Read the resolution too to see what actually happens. You do need to be with the plan and what they do. Visit to Aunt Sally's, what's going on there. Basically the plot of these last 9 chapters you need to be familiar with, and some of the smaller details that you might not be able to get from Spark Notes. Any questions about Huck Finn? We've explored the conflict. We've explored the climax. We know now that the climax is the highest point of suspense. It's also sometimes the turning point of a story. Sometimes it's the same, right? Sometimes the highest point of suspense is the turning point. Sometimes they're not. Sometimes they could be different. And if they're different, if you've got a turning point in a story that's earlier or later, you've got a highest point of suspense, then you've got an argument between people about what the climax could be. Because usually there's only one climax for a story. I mean, you could have like peaks and valleys in a story, but you can argue over which one is more important, more instrumental to the lesson of the story, maybe. But you can see how this climax is instrumental and inseparable from the lesson of the story, right? About what's wrong and what's right. All right, good. So that's Huck Finn. Moving on. London, 21st. We'll finish with Drive. Let's do London first. Short essay, page 17. And before we get fully into it, we said that Jack London was one of the naturalists. We're not reading one of his novels. He's more famous for writing novels. Oh shoot, what novels did he write? White Fang is one of his most famous. He wrote a really good short story too that's pretty popular. It's called, oh shoot, what's it called? I assigned it, if you were in my 1101 class, To Build a Fire. That was one of the ones that was assigned in my 1101 class too. But typically his stories are characters out in an unforgiving wilderness, which fits with the idea of naturalism, right? Because naturalism says that man is powerless in respect to the elements around him, whether they be actual natural elements or societal elements, whatever it might be. All right, so this essay is a personal reflection of his life. All right, this is autobiographical in nature. All right, short essay talking about his experiences. I guess we'll work through it together since it's pretty short. It says, I was born in the working class. Early I discovered enthusiasm, ambition, and ideals. And to satisfy these became the problem of my child life. My environment was crude and rough and raw. I had no outlook, but an uplook, rather. My place in society was at the bottom. Here life offered nothing but sordidness and wretchedness, both of the flesh and the spirit. For here flesh and spirit were alike starved and tormented. Not a very good place to start out, was it? Started out in working class, started out at the bottom. But he said he had an uplook rather than an outlook on life. If you start out at the bottom, nowhere to go but up. That's one way to look at it, right? That's one potential way to look at it. If you start at the bottom, you can say, well, I got nowhere to go but up. That's an optimistic way of looking at it. What's the pessimistic way of looking at it? I'm just stuck there. This is my position. This is where I was born. I'm screwed. Now remember, we said the naturalists usually fell into that category of you're screwed. You have no control really over your situation. Nature is more powerful than you. You know, if there is a God, he's pretty cruel and unforgiving because look at the world you live in, right? And that kind of stuff could have been inspired by the horrors of the Civil War. That type of outlook on life could have, you know, really infected people in America. But he says he had an uplook. So he was optimistic, I think, right? If he's looking up and thinking, okay, I could potentially move my way up. He says, above me towered the colossal edifice of society. What's an edifice? Edifice is just a fancy word for building, like a big building. So consider society as a big building. So we've got a metaphor here, right? Society is a building. You can climb your way to the top, right? If y'all run into words that you don't know, look them up. I have to look up words all the time when I'm doing this kind of literature. More like a what? A ledge? That's a precipice. A precipice would be like an edge. An edifice would be a building. There could be a precipice on an edifice, right? The ledge of a building. But no, an edifice is like this. It usually refers to like a really big building. All right, the edifice of society. Above me towered the colossal edifice of society, and to my mind, the only way out was up. Into this edifice I early resolved to climb. Up above, men wore black clothes and boiled shirts, and women dressed in beautiful gowns. Also, there were good things to eat, and there was plenty to eat, this much for the flesh. Then there were the things of the spirit. Up above me, I knew, were unselfishness of the spirit, clean and noble thinking, keen intellectual living. I knew all this because I read seaside library novels, in which, with the exception of the villains and adventuresses, all men and women thought beautiful thoughts, spoke a beautiful language, and performed glorious deeds. So his view of what upper class society is like came from reading novels. Is that an accurate way to form an opinion or an idea of what upper class society is like? No, shaking your heads no. What, Cody? Depends on the novels. Well, it says these Seaside Library novels, it says they're inexpensive novel series published by George Monroe. Yeah, novels are stories. Same thing. Fiction. Novels are fictional stories. So they're made up. They're fantasy. They're not reality. So should you shape your views of reality based on fictional novels? Yeah. Novels are that yeah, novel is fiction. Not usually. Not usually. You can have you can have novels based on true stories, but usually there's some element of fiction or exaggeration. Usually if it's nonfiction, it's just referred to as nonfiction. For example, what was the movie that was just out recently with the soldiers that were in Afghanistan? Did anybody see that? Yeah, Lone Survivor. Like that was a story that was written, but I think you would just refer to it as nonfiction rather than as a novel. I think novel typically implies fictionality. So the question stands though, is using fiction a good way to shape your views on reality? I think it depends. All right, so then what's the value in fiction? We just read Huck Finn. If it's really useless in forming a view of reality, then what's the value in fiction? Is it strictly entertainment value? Because I think we can get a whole lot more than just strictly entertainment from Huck Finn. I think we can form specific views of reality based on Huck Finn, like what's right and what's wrong in reality. That was a story. That was a made-up story. But the condition of people being in slavery was a real thing. And the condition of, our hearts and our consciences is a real thing. But it seems like the views that Jack London says he shaped of reality were based on more trivial things. Not the themes of the stories, but the details and the descriptions of the people. Those are two totally different things. The theme in a fictional work is powerful and can shape reality. Y'all get that? The theme from Huck Finn regarding what is the right thing to do, that can shape our realities. That can make us think differently. That can make people think differently about how to treat people, what to do, what's right. Is society right all the time? It can make people think differently in reality. But the minor details about Jim and who he was and how he lived, they are arbitrary, right? They may or may not have been exactly true. All right, so depending on how Jack London was reading these stories, it seems like he was more concerned about these details of these people's lives that never really existed than of the truths behind the stories. Does that make sense? So he's shaping his view of reality based on cheap novels, all right, that are probably portraying the upper class as very fancy and perfect, and like he said, not just well-fed, but also spiritually superior. Spiritually superior. Is that true? Are people of the upper class spiritually superior? Intellectually superior? Shaking your head, you think they are? Intellectually superior? Because of actual inherent intellectual capability, or because of probably education? Okay. So not an inherent intellectual superiority, just based on their position in society that allows them to become educated. That makes them more intellectual. Okay. Fair enough. So he goes on and says, They perform glorious deeds. In short, I accepted the rising of the sun. I accepted that up above me, all that was fine and noble and gracious, all that gave decency and dignity to life, all that made life worth living, and remunerated one for his travail and misery. So that's his background. That's the background story of Jack London according to Jack London. All right, everything up above me must have been really good. Where I was sordidness and wretchedness. Right? I was a sailor before the mast, a longshoreman, a roustabout. I worked in canneries and factories and laundries. I mowed lawns and cleaned carpets and washed windows. I never got the product of my toil. Why do you think he did all these things? Why? Things like cleaning, he was trying to work his way up. Seems like it. And he says that he never got the full product of his toil. Not. He had a boss. If you have a boss, you get the full product of your. If you get paid $10 an hour, you're late. So you don't really get the product of your toil. To the daughter of the cannery owner in her carriage, that it was my muscle in part that helped drag along that carriage on its rubber tires. I looked at the son of the factory owner going to college and knew that it was my muscle that helped in part to pay for the wine and good fellowship he enjoyed. But I did not resent this. So he's saying I wasn't jealous. I'm aware that it's my work that's paying for the boss's nice car and nice house and boat, but I didn't resent it. You think he really didn't resent it? He's saying he didn't. Yeah, he said I never got the full product of my toil, but maybe he's okay with that. Maybe he's okay with other people profiting off of his work. He says he doesn't resent it. We'll take him at his word, but it's okay to be skeptical. It's okay to be skeptical. But I did not resent this all in the game. They were strong. Very well, I was strong. It was all in the game. Be more specific. What is the game? Capitalism. The economic system is the game. Right? It was all in the game. They were strong. Very well, I was strong. Remember Darwin, right? Very well, I would carve my way a place amongst them and make money out of the muscles of other men. That's the goal of capitalism, isn't it? Let's stop there for a second. Before we move on, let's stop there. I would play the game. I'll be strong too. And I'll make money off the muscles of other men. Everybody okay with that? Okay, so if he doesn't like it, but that's if we're skeptical. We don't necessarily believe that he wasn't envious. As a system, as an economic system, is that acceptable? Is that right? Is it wrong? Is it good? Is it bad? That's the goal of the system. Does anybody dispute that that's not the goal of the system? I'm asking Michael Edwards' outlook. That's the goal for most people. Climb the ladder, become the boss, exploit other people to become better for yourself. Why would I say exploit? Okay, do you have a better word? Use, take advantage of. If you really want to provide for other people, providing means for other people to make money. But if that were the case, then why would you want to profit for them? You would just give them all your profits. You're making money too. You have to earn a living too. Mm-hmm. you're doing the other. So you're saying that the reply to that.
I send out
Mhm.
here.
Exactly. So I need my fence painted. So I call Ashley's painting service, and she sends out Billy to paint my fence. Why don't I just call Billy?
Because you would have, it, like, publicized, and yet it doesn't have the business, it doesn't
Mhm.
have it incorporated, or
Mhm.
LLC.
Okay.
So why not just call Billy and not rush him to call
And when you own a business, your choice is how you choose to employ it.
Mhm. Okay.
You can look in the search box and pull the tax, the what, what,
Mhm. Okay. Okay. I just want to go back to the one line, because these are all really good thoughts, and this is the kind of stuff I want y'all to be thinking about. But
But he doesn't say exploit, right?
making money out of the muscles of other men. That sounds like exploitation to me. You don't read it that way, though.
No.
Okay. It sounds like he wants to use other people to his advantage, to his gain. He doesn't say, I want to go into business and provide jobs for other people.
But
Said,
when
I
you
want to.
provide jobs for other people, that's just how that works, though.
That is how it
That's
works.
just how a business works.
Okay. Make money out of the muscles of other men. Not make money for the other men.
No, it's make money for me.
Make money for me. I'll be strong. They were strong. I'll be strong too. I won't be weak. Weak left behind. Okay. Carve a place amongst them and make money out of the muscles of other men. I was not afraid of work. I loved hard work. I would pitch in and work harder than ever and eventually become a pillar of society. Achieve the American dream, right? We talked about the American dream. The loose consensus that the American dream is the idea that you can achieve something and move up through society. Fair enough? That's the American dream? Okay. Does it sound like he's after? He says, I'm willing to play. I'll work hard." Okay. And just then, as luck would have it, I found an employer that was of the same mind. I was willing to work, and he was more than willing that I should work. I thought I was learning a trade. In reality, I had displaced two men. I thought he was making an electrician out of me. As a matter of fact, he was making $50 per month out of me. The two men I had displaced had received $40 each per month. I was doing the work of both for $30 per month. This employer worked me nearly to death. A man may love oysters, but too many oysters will disincline him toward that particular diet, and so with me. Too much work sickened me. I did not wish to ever see work again. I fled from work. I became a tramp, begging my way from door to door, wandering over the United States in sweats and slums and prisons. I had been born in the working class, and I was now, at the age of 18, beneath the point at which I had started. I was down in the cellar of society, down in the subterranean depths of misery, about which it is neither nice nor proper to speak. I was in the pit, the abyss, the human cesspool, the shambles, the shambles and charnel house of our civilization. This is the part of the edifice of society that society chooses to ignore. Lack of space compels me here to ignore it, and I shall say only the things I saw there gave me a terrible scare. I was scared into thinking. I saw the naked simplicities of the complicated civilization in which I lived. Life was a matter of food and shelter. In order to get food and shelter, men sold things. The merchants sold shoes. The politicians sold his manhood. I love that line. And the representative of the people, with the exceptions, of course, sold his trust. All sold their honor. Women, too, whether on the street or in the holy bond of wedlock, come to sell their flesh. All things were commodities. All people bought and sold. It's interesting because this is before even women. Even women were still selling themselves, either through the holy bonds of wedlock, where they sell their flesh away to a man, or through prostitution on the street. It's a pretty interesting parallel to draw, right? He's saying that's what women had to offer. They couldn't join the workforce, so what they were offering was their bodies. But it didn't matter. It didn't matter if you were man, woman, young, old, sell something to get something, right? The one commodity that labor had to sell was muscle. Alone to sell. But there was a difference. Jews and trust and honor had a way of renewing themselves. Perishable stocks. Muscle, on the other hand, did not renew. As the shoe merchant sold shoes, he continued to replenish his stock. But there was no way of replenishing the laborer's stock of muscle. The more he sold of his muscle, the more remained to him. It was one commodity, and each day his stock of it diminished. In the end, if he did not die before, he sold out and put his shop, muscle bankrupt, remained but to go out into the society and perish miserably. Further, that brain was likewise a commodity. It too was different from muscle. Brain and his wares were fetching higher prices than ever, but a laborer was without a I'd been in the cellar of society, and I did not like the place as a habitation. The pipes and drains were unsanitary, and the air was bad to breathe. If I could not live on the parlor floor of society, I could, at any rate, have a try at the attic. It was true, the diet there was slim, but at least the air was pure, so I resolved to sell no more muscle and to become a vendor of brains. What is he talking about here with this analogy? What is the analogy he's making when he talks about I can't live on the parlor floor of society? So instead, I'm going to have a try at the attic. Where is he going? What is he talking about? Huh? Okay. He wants to get out of the basement. And he's already referred to society as an edifice or a building, and now we'll say the building is a house, right? He's saying he can't live on the parlor floor, and you're saying that means he can't live like high society does. But he'll have a try at the attic, which is, spatially speaking, above the parlor floor, right? The parlor floor is the living room. That's where nice furniture is, right? That's usually where people put their best stuff. That's where the rich people would be, on the parlor floor. But if you're talking about climbing up the edifice of society, as you go up, things are supposed to get better, right? So isn't the parlor floor, shouldn't that be at the top? Because he's saying, no, I can't make it, I'm not going to make it there, but I'll have a try at the attic. Okay, the attic's where you throw away. Yeah. Let me ask you this, Brett. Would you rather live in an attic or on the parlor floor? Parlor floor.
But I just said it's a reference.
But there's a reason he's using the attic. Society. And he's saying the top of society is not the parlor floor. The top of society is the attic. Now, how does this jive? How does this make sense? Yeah, in what society? Society tells you that the parlor floor, that's where all the good stuff is. It's where all the capitalists that are successful and make money out of the muscle of other people, that's where they end up with their material wealth, because that's where the wealth is. The wealth is not in the attic. Yeah, exactly, almost exactly. Think about it. Vendors of brains, he said teacher, known for their salaries, Mercedes, and living life on the parlor floor. Really? That's one out of how many teachers? Faculty right now. guess that's a good thing, right?
It is, they just pay full price, and so we lose $5,000.
So now we have cheaper insurance.
Now we have to.
Okay. I'm good with that, I guess. But these vendors of brains, intellectuals, not known for their material wealth, right? Not known for living in the basement, but not known for living on the parlor floor, except for maybe that one teacher, right? But as a whole, so a minority, a very small minority, ended up doing pretty well and living on the parlor floor. Well, and what you're talking about administrators, aren't you? It doesn't matter. Are they? Are they? Is administrating and teaching two different things? Yeah, coach. You know what? You know what? That takes me to an interesting sidetrack. Do y'all know who the highest paid state employee in the state of Georgia is? The highest paid state employee, public employee for the state of Georgia. And this is the same with about 40 states in the United States. It's the same governor, I'll tell you that. It's not a judge. It's not Board of Education, but it's loosely related to education. It's not the president of college. The highest paid state employee in the state of Georgia is Mark Rick, the football coach for the University of Georgia. He makes a lot of money. And that's the same for roughly the other coaches up in the Northeast, basketball coach. But he works for the University of Georgia, which is a publicly funded. So what does that tell? Now I'm way off. What does that tell you about our values as a society that our highest paid public employees are coaches of football teams? It tells you we like football a lot. But shouldn't it be, like a judge or a governor or president of a higher learning, not the football coach of an institution of higher learning? Like, do we value education or do we value sports? The obvious, right? Do you think they do? I doubt it. I doubt it. There are a lot of donors to the college. Right. Mhm.
And then you had went to UGA, like it would reflect positively into all this cool stuff in UGA.
Maybe. Maybe. It could.
The whole goal of having
What is the point of having a good football team for an institution that's supposed to deliver higher learning?
money.
For money?
Everything's about money.
Everything's about money. I agree. You're bringing things about money. Jackson disagrees. And that's why he says he's going to have a try at the attic instead of the parlor floor. The parlor floor is where everything's about money. The attic is where the vendors of brains go, where things aren't about money, because that's not where you have the nice furniture and the nice things and the materialistic things. Right? That's not what the attic is. The attic is sparse. But he says, the attic was true, the diet there was, so you're not going to get the fattest paycheck, you're not going to have the best stuff, you're not going to have the fullest belly, but the air was at least pure. He's saying the air on the parlor floor is not necessarily pure. The air in the basement definitely is pure. So the air there is pure. Sell no more muscle and to become a vendor of brains. Then began a frantic pursuit of knowledge. I returned to California and opened the books, while thus equipping myself to become a brain merchant. It was inevitable that I should delve into sociology. There I found in a certain class of books, scientifically formulated, the simple sociological concepts I had already worked out for myself. Other and greater minds before I was born had worked out all that I had thought and a vast deal more. I discovered that I was a socialist. The socialists were revolutionists, inasmuch as they struggled to overthrow the society of the present and out of the material to build the society of the future. I, too, was a socialist and a revolutionist. I joined the groups of working class and intellectual revolutionists, and for the first time came into intellectual living. Here I found keen flashing intellects and brilliant wits, for here I met strong and alert-brained, with horny-handed members of the working class, unfrocked preachers too wide in their Christianity for any congregation of mammon worshippers, professors broken on the wheel of university subservience to the ruling class and flung out because they were quick with knowledge, which they strove to apply to the affairs of mankind. Here I found also warm faith in the human, glowing idealism, sweetness of unselfishness, renunciation and martyrdom, all the stinging things of the spirit. Here life was clean, noble, and alive. Here life rehabilitated itself, became wonderful and glorious, and I was glad to be alive. I was in touch with great souls who exalted flesh and spirit over dollars and cents, and to whom the veil of the child meant more than all the pomp and circumstance of the commercial expansion and world empire. All about me were nobleness of purpose and heroism of effort. My days and nights were sunshine and starshine, all fire and dew. Before my eyes were burning and blazing, the holy Christ's own grail, the warm, human, long-suffering, maltreated, but to be rescued and saved. Pretty rosy picture of socialism. Does he? Does it mean something other than socialism? You tell me. He says he discovered he was a socialist, or he was a socialist. A perfect picture of socialism. Is any system going to be perfect? So is his depiction, is his description accurate? There's an ideal to things and there's a reality to things, right? There's an ideal American dream rooted in capitalism, that anybody that works hard will succeed, will improve their station in life. Why doesn't he like capitalism? Originally he did. He said he would play the game. Why doesn't he like it?
He's learning that that's not really
Yes, but that kind of came afterwards.
Like
The guy overworked him.
saw the flaws.
He saw the flaws. Think about it. There's an ideal to the American dream rooted in capitalism. But is that the reality? Does anyone that works hard automatically improve their station in life? Why not? What's wrong? Then what's wrong with the American dream? What's wrong with the ideal? What's the problem? There's a lot of variables. I'll give you one. I'll give you one important variable. What if you have 100 people attempting to achieve the American dream, but you only have 90 jobs available? Exactly. It goes back to that Darwinian idea of survival of the fittest. But what if all 100 are willing to play the game and willing to work as hard as they can, but there are only 90 jobs? Is that fair to the weakest 10? Is there the question is, if the strongest 90 get the jobs, is the American dream, the ideal of the American dream, is that a reality for everyone? How if there's only 90 jobs? But I'm telling you that these 100 people are all willing to work and play the game like Jack London was, but there are only 90 jobs. Life isn't fair. So that's your answer to the American dream? Life isn't fair? That's your answer to the dream? Fair? We can't do better than that? Yes, it's not realistic. Then why do we have an unemployment rate? Why do we track an unemployment rate? Sure, no, that's exactly, no. You've got a misunderstanding what the unemployment rate is. Unemployment rate is the number of jobs available. It's the number of people who say they're in the labor force, which either means they're working or looking for a job. So it's exactly the 90 jobs available versus 100 people looking for work in the labor force.
But the way they take that is, let's say, welfare state. You have to be looking for a job.
Mhm.
But how many of those people are really looking for a job?
I don't know.
Not all of them are actually looking for a job.
So you think that there are more jobs available than people looking for jobs? Really?
There's a lot, go look at McDonald's if you have to.
Mm-hmm.
Walmart always hires. Walmart works way $10 an hour, they even get, my aunt, my uncle, they make, their managers, they make almost $30 an hour at Walmart.
What you're saying, I understand your argument, but I'm telling you that the numbers don't add up. And yes, Walmart is always hiring, and there could be, between the fast food sector and all the minimum wage paying jobs in America, there could be right now advertised in newspapers 2 million jobs across the country. But I'm telling you there are 3 million people that are actively trying to find jobs. So yes, there may be jobs available, but there are more people than jobs available.
The way I see it, if you want to get a job bad enough, you'll do it.
Okay. But theoretically, if all 3 million of these people want that job bad enough, and they all applied today for the 2 million, then the American dream is constant that anybody, and that theory falls on its face. And like you said, life's not fair. Okay, Ashley?
Like, what's a unemployment rate? It's a constant.
Right now, I think it's just below 7%.
Yeah.
When times are good, it's about 5.
It's a 10% that it's well higher.
Well, it's either 10 or 7. I mean, it's one or the other. The Bureau of Labor Statistics reports it to be under 7%.
So it's a constant. There's a constant unemployment.
Because you're no longer part of the labor force.
Fair.
Fair enough.
And it's actually over here.
Okay. Fair enough. So it's higher than the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports. Okay, fine.
We have unemployed people because people, there's constantly different people who are unemployed.
I know, and that's why I try to simplify it and say, let's talk in theory. Let's not talk reality, because reality is far too complicated and there are far too many variables. Let's talk theory. All right, this concept, because that's what capitalism is. Capitalism is a theory. Socialism is a theory. All right, that's where we're starting. Reality is going to skew things in a million different ways.
100 people, and you say there's 90 jobs.
Right.
Well, not all 100 of them want the jobs all at the same time. But if they did,
That's what I'm saying.
that would
If they
be
did.
a really weird instance.
But it's really not, because you just expand those numbers. You expand the 100, people to the hundreds of thousands or millions that are looking for a job now, and you expand the available jobs to be less than the number of people looking, and then you have your unemployment rate. Everybody following me there? I'm trying to simplify it.
Even if you say there was just like, what is it, like 9 jobs?
Mm-hmm.
And, well, sometimes, like, this 9 wants to work, and then this 10 wants to work, and this 8 wants to work.
Mhm.
And then all 10 want to work, but, and then they get a job, and then 2 weeks later, say, oh, so don't work. So it's constantly changing. The same person isn't wanting that
Yeah.
same job all the time.
Yeah, like I said, there are variables, and it gets complicated.
But
But if we're talking theory,
everybody could move up, not the ladder in exponential terms, like this guy, he wanted to get to the top.
right.
And then once this one guy started working too hard, he's just like, oh, I'm giving up.
That's a fair criticism, Ashley. So your criticism is he gave up too soon.
Yeah, I mean, that's one guy.
That's a fair criticism. He said by the time I was 18, I was done with it. Now, by the time he was 18, I'll give him some credit. He was a sailor, a longshoreman. He worked in canneries, factories, laundries, mowed lawns, cleaned carpets, washed windows. And I imagine a lot of these things he was doing concurrently at the same time.
Why?
This is by the time he was 18, too.
During all that stuff, he's like, yeah, I was doing all this stuff, I've been doing great, obviously making money in all these fucking.
Or not making money in these venues, because the rules and the restrictions on wages hadn't really been in place yet. So capitalism was really running amok. Capitalism was unregulated and that there was no minimum wage. So that's why he was working in a cannery and mowing lawns and doing all these things, because he wasn't able to sustain himself.
Well, right now, we have this ongoing thought that we need a minimum wage,
Mhm.
that people want to raise it. But it's like, because you're in a common working place, just like stocks, how they change, they don't have a minimum, and then
Mhm.
there's some stocks that are really high.
Mhm.
People who do a really good job will end up getting paid more. So even if you didn't have a minimum wage, you probably start out at $2. And if you didn't last long, or you can still stay at that $2, then
So do you think that there should be some people that are either maybe intellectually incapable of doing anything more than mopping floors? Do you think that they should be stuck at $2 because that's what the market will pay them?
no, but because like
Them a raise if they didn't have to. If I owned the company, I could get away with paying someone $2 an hour to mop my floor.
but nobody would take that job.
Are you sure?
Somebody would.
There are people through. Let me tell you something. There are people throughout this country that do not make minimum wage right now. They work, they don't make minimum wage. They're guest workers. They're here on visas from other countries. And the companies that hire them get waivers so that they don't have to pay minimum wage. I think a lot of these places are right down the street in Gainesville. And they, I'm telling you, no, I'm talking legitimate companies. Legitimate companies get waivers from the government that they don't have to pay minimum wage, and they can pay $2 or $3 an hour to these people.
I mean, I'm not
And they do.
I can take $2.
These people don't make tips. These people make $2, $3 an hour.
Do that.
Because how can they do it? Because it's legalized, and the federal government grants waivers.
I'm here from another country with a visa. So I could go to Walmart and get paid minimum wage.
Not unless Walmart has a waiver.
The visa is legal. Visa?
Mhm.
That means it's legal. Are you still doing everything? Have a visa?
I think you may have to get these visas after you've already received, employment from one of these companies that gets the waivers. So basically, you're saying, I'm going to come to a company to work for Joe's Crab Shack. Because Joe's Crab Shack, even if you are free to work at any company you want, I mean, if no other company is going to hire you because of maybe language barriers, maybe you're unaware of even how to apply for another company, but you do know that this company will take you, is it fair? I mean, these people are not slaves. They're not forced to work there.
This idea of fair and your like your own motivation,
Mhm.
if you have a problem with language barriers, you could yourself. And like let's say like I know there's some ways that you can get like money to go to school and people get those millions of dollars in scholarships.
Mhm.
Well, that's not fair. It's not fair. It's just people don't go out and do it.
Don't go out and do what?
Don't go out and put the effort to get scholarships. Like people, like school's so expensive. Yes, it is. But there's so many put yourself some effort.
Is it fair that, here's an example for you then. Speaking, you're bringing up school tuition. There are states right now that have passed legislation that will allow immigrants, illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, to receive in-state tuition rather than paying out-of-state tuition.
Yeah, I don't think that's fair at all.
Not fair to who?
Yeah, the people.
What if these immigrants are people that were brought to the country when they were children? They went to Gainesville High School. They graduated from Gainesville High School. They've lived in Georgia their almost entire lives. They shouldn't get to come to Lanier Tech and pay in-state tuition like everybody else that graduated from a Georgia high school.
I'm telling you, immigrants.
They should have what?
Taxes.
They should have to pay out-of-state tuition. They should be able to pay in-state tuition.
But you're saying, like,
But they're illegal.
they're not legal if they're not like
We have state income tax. That's a tax.
Not every, it's people though, you're not gonna be paying.
If you buy anything within the state, you're paying tax. You're not paying income tax.
But you're not paying
Your land,
taxes.
Are you paying taxes on the money you make?
Not if you're illegal.
No, you, Brett.
Oh, yeah.
Are you?
Taxes, yeah.
You do?
Yeah.
Are you a dependent? Are you claimed as a dependent? Then you don't have to pay any tax. What? You don't have to pay any tax. And if you make under under $6,000, you don't have to pay any tax. You really don't.
No, no,
I
but
owe taxes
I,
on
I pay $45 into the system, it's gonna take me $25 to get my taxes done, so I only make $45.
You can do your taxes for free by yourself. Well, then you're lazy, and you need to do your own taxes.
I was told